I'd like to start by introducing Elder Dr. Roberta, who will be opening the Uproot Symposium for us today. For close to 4 decades, Elder Dr. Roberta Price has actively shared her leadership, wisdom, and teachings at UBC and throughout the Lower Mainland to assist both Indigenous and non-Indigenous community members to achieve improved outcomes in healthcare. A member of the Coast Salish and Snuneymuxw and Cowichan nations, she has been instrumental in helping to create shared spaces for both Indigenous and Western approaches to healing and health. Her ongoing involvement and leadership in research projects has been key to the continued work of decolonizing healthcare and creating cultural safety and equity for Indigenous patients. Elder Dr. Roberta Price received an honorary doctorate from UBC in 2021 in recognition of her substantial contribution to society. Welcome, Elder Dr. Roberta Price.
OCM, thanks so much, Evelyn, for your warm introduction. Just picking up my cedar boughs and my sweetgrass. I put on my cedar headband, everyone. And as taught to me by my elders, when you put on parts of your regalia or your full regalia, you're giving an indication to the ancestors and the creator that you're going to share some very important words, share some ceremony. Thank you for listening to the teachings of our ancestors, everyone. Haichka, Haichka Siam Siaya. Greetings and welcome, everyone. As Coast Salish matriarch and elder, I wish to give a very warm thank you to all my relatives on the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh for welcoming me to live in the unceded lands of my relatives, Musqueam, here in Richmond, going on 43 years now. As Coast Salish matriarch and elder, I wish to give each and every one a very warm welcome who live, work, and play, give and receive service, teach and learn on our unceded, ancestral, and occupied lands of my relatives, Musqueam, Squamish, respectfully calling upon each and every one of you in this wide virtual time out of your day, your week, your month, to give honor and thanks to all the ancestors of the lands in which you live, work, and play on. Osiam. Holding my hands up in honor and thanks to my beautiful mentor teaching elders, Elder Vince Stogan from Musqueam, Elder Bob George from Tsleil-Waututh, who always follow in their mentoring footsteps and their teachings, who always share a blessing and a prayer whenever we come together. Thank you again, everyone, for listening to the teachings of our ancestors. Start us off in a good and respectful way. Haichka, Haichka Osiam, Osiam. We give you many, many thanks, Creator, for bringing us all together here in this wide virtual circle in such a warm and respectful way. We ask, Creator, that you bless the ones who are away due to illness or other obligations. Bless the ones who will join us, help them to join safely. We call upon you, Creator, to bring your blessings down upon our minds, our hearts, our bodies, our spirits. So when we think our thoughts, they are good, positive, and respectful. When we speak our words, they are good, positive, and respectful. And we call upon you, Creator, to bless the people who prepare the food and drink. Bless the food and drink we put in to nourish our bodies on our journeys to wellness and strength. We give you kind thanks each and every day, Creator, for the special blessings of protection you bring down upon all the beautiful people who are working so very hard in so many ways, in so many places during this pandemic, for all illnesses, for the safe delivery of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and especially for the ongoing opioid crisis. Continue to bless and protect them and their families, Creator. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to bring very, very special blessings of protection and healing down upon all our relatives right across Turtle Island, who have reopened wounds and are grieving all over again over the ongoing daily media release. Bless and protect all of our relatives in health and healing, Creator. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to bring very special blessings of protection and healing down upon all the beautiful families who are suffering that oppression over in the Ukraine. Bless and protect those families in health and healing, Creator. And we call upon you, Creator, to bless all the families worldwide who are living under oppression. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to bring very special blessings of protection and healing down upon all the families who are experiencing the wounds put upon Mother Earth and the effects of those wounds put upon Mother Earth through the extreme rain, wind, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, and earthquakes that have especially recently impacted Turkey and Syria, ongoing in Afghanistan, Haiti, and many parts of the world as we meet here today. Bless and protect those families in health and healing, Creator. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to wrap each and every one of us here and all of our loved ones in your warmest blanket of protection as we all continue on this part of the journey of our lives into 2023 and beyond. Help us each to keep safe in our travels, both near and far, Creator. And we always give you many, many thanks, Creator, as we ask you to bring all of your blessings down upon all the ones that are hurting, all the ones that are grieving, all the ones that are hungry, all the ones without homes, and especially, Creator, all the ones that are hurting, all the ones that are grieving. Haichka, Haichka, Osiam, Osiam. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Osiam, Osiam. Pass the cedar boughs back. Osiam.
Thank you, Elder Roberta, for opening our symposium today and for everything you do to support us. Ani everyone, Evelyn George Indigenous Makwendode Nipissing Dundiba. My name is Evelyn George, and I am Nipissing Anishinaabe through my father, from Nipissing First Nation, and French settler through my mother. I'm joining today from Syilx territory. I'm a midwife within a family of midwives, and I am community engagement lead for the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives. On behalf of both of NACM's co-chairs, Brenda Ipu and Alicia Julian Reed, I would like to extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you to the Uproot Symposium. So a little bit about NACM, National Aboriginal Council of Midwives. You'll hear us refer to as NACM. NACM exists to promote excellence in reproductive health care for Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. We advocate for the restoration of midwifery education, the provision of midwifery services, and choice of birthplace for all Indigenous communities, consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As active members of the Canadian Association of Midwives, we represent the professional development and practice needs of Indigenous midwives to the responsible health authorities in Canada and the global community. Indigenous midwives enable access to culturally safe sexual and reproductive health care for Indigenous families, the return of birth to Indigenous communities, and a reduction in the number of medical evacuations for births in remote areas. So here we are at the Uproot Symposium. I am going to share my screen now. I have a few slides just to orient you to the symposium itself before we dive into the exciting content and presentations we have planned for you. So if you'll allow me just one moment here to do that. Sorry, just a second here. It's my computer that's slow right now. So as this is loading, I want to let you know that if you find your internet connection really tricky today and you're not able to hear well, or the video isn't streaming and you're having difficulty staying connected, we are going to be mailing out USB copies and all of the translations that we're having done today. It's being translated into Inuktitut in both Nunavut and Nunavut dialects. And these will be available as a mail out USB, like a physical USB will arrive, but only if it's you're really having a hard time with your internet and you're not likely to be able to stream it online at a later time. I'm not too sure why my presentation won't load. So I hope you all received your swag bags today. I'm just really trying to get this going. I'm sorry. It's just not going to work. Okay. So in the swag bag is just a little something to be able to give you a little something directly to your mailbox. We have a copy there of the Restoring Midwifery and Birth Workbook and the Indigenous Midwifery Knowledge and Skills, the Framework of Competencies that NACM created. 2 useful tools for restoring Indigenous midwifery and birth. I think what I'll do is I'll share my screen because you'll still see a mini version of the presentation. And if you have, you might still be able to see. It's just not sharing like the full screen. So we'll do that so you have something to look at anyways. So we had planned for Carol Cucci to hold a parallel discussion room and debriefing space. Carol Cucci is an elder midwife within the NACM community and was going to be holding kind of a parallel space for debriefing and discussion, just because sometimes talking about these things can be really emotional and it can be difficult, and sometimes there are things to process. And so, but we're not able to do that today, but we will be sending in the there's going to be a news flash to arrive in your inbox after the symposium. Within a couple of days, we'll send information on doing that with Carol at another time. In terms of participation, we invite you to please drop a pin on our interactive map. It's really exciting to see where you're coming in from. It's also potentially an opportunity for you to connect with one another, and you can leave, if you're comfortable, to leave your information there, or even just the place where you work. That might be a way of connecting with one another and helping to advance this work together. We also have an ideas and a message board, and if our admin team can be posting the links to these as we do that. I put the quotable quotes here because sometimes people say something really powerful, and it's just nice to share what really resonated with you, what really stuck with you. We always love to hear those things. And if you have any other ideas or thoughts and things that you want to share, we would love for that to be a discussion and a place of community for today during the symposium. We are going to be doing some Slido polls just for fun and just to keep you involved. And we also have door prizes, and we have beautiful door prizes that have been donated to us through Creators Gifts, which is a fabric and art shop in Hiawatha, Ontario. And we have received more gifts than we expected. And so we'll be doing more draws than we thought. So at each break and at the end, we'll be doing a door prize draw. So you can look forward to that. So I'd like to start by going over to Slido. So if you have never used Slido, what we do here is you'll go into another tab in your browser and just open it up. And this is a question for Indigenous participants. So when you go to slido.com, you'll see enter the code. This is the code that you're going to enter here, 2306707. You'll key that into the code there. You should see here, I'm going to stop my share because you'll want to look at your screen. Okay, so hopefully you've got that working. So this is a question for Indigenous participants. So if you're here and you're able to get into the Slido, the question is, what does birth mean to you? And we're going to form a little word cloud here. It only takes a minute. Share the code in the chat. So I'll share my screen again so you can see the beautiful responses that are coming up. In case you're not able to make it onto Slido right now. I think this is where. It's not letting, my computer is just really slow today. I'm sorry for that, but I hope that you're able to see all of the different responses that came in. So then we're gonna stop this one. And what we'll do is I'll do a screen grab of the completed word cloud and we'll post it during the break. So a new one is, what does Indigenous midwifery mean to you? So we're shifting the conversation, Indigenous birth, what does it mean to have Indigenous midwives? And this is again for Indigenous participants. We will have more like this later on for everybody, but let's hear from our Indigenous participants. What does Indigenous midwifery mean to you? So maybe we'll leave that to populate a little bit as we carry on. I'll leave that one open. Again, I'll do a screen grab and we'll look at that on the break just for fun. So, you know, lots of people are very comfortable feel very comfortable talking about colonialism and colonization and really have a clear sense of what that all means and what that is. And for some people, maybe this is the first time you're really involved in a conversation like this and hearing presentations about this. So first of all, I wanted to mention that on your email about an hour ago, you would have received a video about midwifery. So if midwifery itself is still something that you're not very familiar with, I recommend having a look at that video. But also just to really get clear on what we're talking about around colonialism. And this is just to say around the use of language here. I hope I'm not paused. That colonization is the act of creating a colony. This is the physical creating of the new colony. And colonialism is the thinking behind that, the philosophy behind that, and largely involves, sorry. Okay. So this is the way of thinking and approaching things. So colonialism involves a power dynamic where the colonizers dominate over the colonized in various forms of control. It involves a set of assumptions about Indigenous inferiority, you know, things like we don't make good decisions, or we're dangerous, or we're bad parents, and things like this. And that we're in the way of progress around this new society. It involves assumptions about settler superiority, kind of thinking around we're the rational or we're the responsible ones. Colonialism involves intentionally setting up systems to enforce and maintain that control over Indigenous people's lives and bodies. And these systems replaced existing Indigenous systems that worked and had been perfected over millennia. And so I had always wanted to be a healthcare provider all my life. I don't remember a time where I didn't want to be involved in healthcare. And I was so proud to be part of this great healthcare system, you know, thinking that way. But the reality is that our healthcare system across history has been used as a tool to dominate and control over Indigenous people's lives and bodies. And it's been very harmful. And so colonialism shows up now as sometimes direct harm to Indigenous people in the healthcare system. We know this. It also shows up as health policy. And this is around the way that things are implemented or the way that decisions are made about health services, and the way decisions are made about what kinds of services will be available to who, how is that done, and things like this. And really the symposium is to just kind of really talk about where are we seeing these barriers, how are we understanding them as colonial barriers, and then how do we move forward? And so the idea behind the symposium here is really to learn together, to connect with one another on this, to really develop a strong understanding of what is all happening around the barriers to restoring Indigenous birth and midwifery. I think with the presentations, you'll learn a lot, but also hear a lot about the barriers, but also hearing a lot about the resistance and about different ways forward and different things that are being done that are seeing success. And we know that it sometimes doesn't necessarily feel good to talk about these things, but we hope that in the end you will come away inspired. The last couple of presentations that we have are very concretely on actionable things and tools and resources, and we hope that will leave things in a positive note. So that's where I want to leave that. So Natalie Pembrin is going to take over as the MC for the symposium. Natalie is a Franco-Métis midwife from the Red River. Natalie is committed to Indigenous health innovation that is accessible and equitable. As past leader of national midwifery associations, they built unique partnership between Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations that respect self-determination and reciprocity. This model has informed decolonized approaches to global relationships and improved health impacts. So welcome to Natalie.
So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm pleased to present our first presenter, Claire Dion Fletcher, who will be speaking to us about midwifery regulation. Claire is a Lenape, Potawatomi, and mixed settler registered midwife. She's an assistant professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University Midwifery Education Program in Toronto, and a past co-chair of the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives. Her teaching focuses on Indigenous midwifery and social justice issues. Claire is deeply committed to increasing diversity in the midwifery profession through Indigenous-led education. She completed her Master's of Arts in Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies at York University, where her research focused on decolonized healthcare and Indigenous midwifery. Claire is committed to reproductive justice and Indigenous feminism and how these frameworks shape midwifery education and practice. She is an adoring auntie to her niece and nephews. Without further ado, I leave it to Claire, and we'll have some time at the end for a question and answer period.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm just gonna set up my sharing of my screen here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so thanks for that intro, Natalie, and thank you, Elder Roberta, for opening us in such a nice way, and thank you to all of the organizers and all the hard work that I know went into putting together this wonderful symposium. I'm really happy to be a part of it. Natalie kind of talked about who I am, so I'm not going to go into that. But I will say I'm coming to you today from my home in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to a number of people from a number of different nations. So I'm going to just start I'm going to be talking today about regulation. I'm going to go through a little bit of a background about what midwifery regulation is. And really, I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the issues and the questions that we can have around regulation, and in what ways can we use regulation to advance Indigenous midwifery, and in what ways might it be a barrier? So from Natalie's intro, you could probably, I think she said, I am a registered midwife. So I work in a model of midwifery where I'm regulated by the College of Midwives of Ontario. I'm actually not currently practicing, and I'm focused on teaching. But I think this is an important thing to note about the way that I worked when I did work clinically. And I want to just say, like, the point of my presentation today is not to say that like regulation is inherently bad, or that, thinking about how we think we, be safe midwives, how we educate midwives, having ideas about standards, those things I think are good, and that some forms of regulation and checks and balances are important. Overall, regulation is about safety, and I'm going to get into that a little bit. And we all want safe midwifery care in our communities. It's what our communities deserve to have. But I want us today to think about questioning how our current systems came about, what they came out of, whether the current systems for regulation that we have are working for everyone. To think about, are they actually keeping Indigenous families, communities, and nations safe? Also, how they value certain people's knowledge and devalue other people's knowledge, and just to overall think about the importance of accountability and who we are accountable to when we're talking about Indigenous midwifery. And to think about, like, the pregnant people we take care of, the community we're a part of, the nation we're a part of, and who really we are accountable to. And so those are the kind of overarching questions that I want us to think about when we're talking about regulation today. Okay, so what is midwifery regulation? So midwifery regulation is really, when you boil it down, it is the laws that relate to both the education and the practice of midwifery. So in places where midwifery is regulated, not just anyone can call themselves a midwife. So in Canada, the midwifery is regulated by the provinces. All provinces now have midwifery regulation. And so you can't just call yourself a midwife. You have to meet certain standards, and those standards are defined through midwifery regulation. So regulation defines who can be a midwife, what their training and education needs to be, what skills they need to have to be midwives. We sometimes refer to these as core competencies. We think about or define what skills they need to have to keep up, to continue being safe midwives. These are sometimes referred to as continuing competencies. And it's really regulation provides a set of criteria and processes that is based in the legislation or the laws of the province, that identify who is entitled to legally practice and call themselves a midwife. So again, I have here on the slide just some of the main parts of regulation. So regulation usually includes, what skills does someone need to be a midwife? What are the education standards? What is the process for becoming a registered midwife? It often includes or will include a process for how to make a complaint, and what the disciplinary process is for a midwife who isn't meeting those standards. And then also how you might become registered in one jurisdiction if you were a registered midwife and trained in another jurisdiction. So for example, in Canada, how if you trained in Ontario, what is the process for moving to another province to become a registered midwife in that province? So these are all things that would be considered part of midwifery regulation. The quote I have there on this slide is from the ICM, which is the International Confederation of Midwives. So that's an international body that represents midwifery. And they have a piece on legislation and recommendations around legislation and description of what it is. And I just thought this quote kind of spoke to what they see as legislation and regulation. So the quote from the ICM is, "For the individual midwife, regulation provides processes which enable them to reveal that they have required skills to practice midwifery safely according to national requirements." So again, regulation is really about how do we ensure that midwives have the skills they need to be safe midwives, and how do we ensure that they continue to provide safe care? So when we really boil it down through all of these different things and laws, that to me is really what regulation is about. How do we ensure safe midwives? So in Canada, in each of the provinces, each province and territory has a regulatory body that is responsible for that work. And then nationally, there's the Canadian Midwifery Regulators Council, which is a network of the different provincial and territory regulatory bodies who come together and as a group collectively regulate, or in their specific jurisdictions, collectively regulate the process of midwifery, setting and maintaining high standards of practice, and ensuring regulatory harmony across the country. They set the Canadian midwifery competencies, establish national standards for midwifery practice, administer the national midwifery exam, and approve education and bridging programs. So in each of the provinces, there's the different regulatory bodies, and these are called different, they have different names, but they have a similar role in each of the provinces and territories. So oftentimes these are called like the college. So for example, the College of Midwives of Alberta, the Saskatchewan College of Midwives, the College of Midwives of Ontario. In some provinces and territories, it is referred to as a council. So the Midwifery Council of New Brunswick is an example. And in some places, it's part of the government structure. So this is mostly in the territories, but an example is the Government of Yukon Professional Licensing and Regulatory Affairs is responsible for regulation of midwifery. So this is just like a really quick kind of overview of what regulation is and the different terms in the different provinces that might be used as to describe the body that is doing the regulating of midwifery in that province. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about like different ways or the different ways midwifery regulation across Canada looks like. And really, this is actually should be more about midwifery. A better title would be like exemption midwifery exemption across Canada. So there is in some provinces, and I've broken them down here on this slide, what we call an exemption in the laws, the legislation for midwives, for Indigenous midwives, to not be regulated in the like college model. So an important part is this, like, it doesn't mean they're not regulated. It doesn't mean that they're not safe midwives who are providing excellent care in their communities. It means that they are not registered with the college or the regulatory body for the province. And there is a different method for accountability and safety, and that comes from within the community. So a prime example of that in Canada is in Ontario. So in Ontario, there is an exemption in the Midwifery Act that allows Indigenous midwives to call themselves and practice as Indigenous midwives and be recognized by Indigenous midwives as by their community, as opposed to being registered with the college. So this is one example. I'm not going to focus too much on this difference. There are many more people who work under this model who are more able to talk about this. I'm going to give us like an overview today of regulation across Canada and some of the barriers. So then there are provinces, Quebec and British Columbia. They have exemptions for Indigenous midwifery in their laws, but for various reasons, they're not enacted. And I added yet because there are things going on. This is a really exciting time for Indigenous midwifery. There's lots of growth happening and lots of different ideas about what midwifery and Indigenous midwifery can look like. And so I want to be sure that we say that they're not enacted yet, but there is exemptions in the laws in Quebec and British Columbia. And then the rest of the provinces and territories are in this third list, which is provinces that don't have exemptions currently in the Midwifery Act or the laws that govern midwifery in those provinces. Okay, I'm going to just very quickly talk about this because I think a lot of people who are on the call today have an understanding of colonization and the ways colonialism plays out. And Evelyn gave us that great definition at the beginning of what of colonization and colonialism and how we see this play out. But in terms of thinking about regulation, is that I want to just talk about how, violence against Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, gender diverse people is a tool of colonization and has been and continues to be a tool of colonization. So we see this through murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people, control of reproduction through forced sterilization, the control of our families through apprehension of children, and a control through an attack on Indigenous midwifery. So what I want us to think about when we're thinking about, what I think is important to think about when we're thinking about regulation is that the control of Indigenous midwifery and specifically Indigenous midwifery knowledge and how we work and how we take care of our communities has been and continues to be a tool of colonization. To say we have to work a certain way, to not value our knowledge is a tool of colonization. And whether that is the intent of regulation at this point, I don't think it is, but even if that is not the current intent of regulation, this is the history that we are working with, and this is the experience of our communities and nations, that the control and attack of Indigenous midwifery and Indigenous midwifery knowledge is a tool of colonization, and that continues to play a role in how we think about regulation moving forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about professionalization of midwifery, and professionalization and regulation, I think, kind of go hand in hand. And so when I'm talking about professionalization, what I mean is how midwifery became a regulated health profession in many places across the country, across actually the world, right? Midwifery, people are practicing midwifery in their communities. You have traditional birth attendants or lay midwives or community midwives, all these different names for women and people who were providing sexual and reproductive health care to their families, to their communities. As we are gaining more acceptance of midwifery and talking about midwifery being regulated, we're also talking about midwifery becoming professionalized. And this was a critical aspect for and way for midwifery to grow and to be accepted as a healthcare profession, and for people to recognize midwives provide good care. And a part of doing that is to show that midwives have standards. So we have standards, we follow standards, we have education programs, we learn these specific things, we have rules that we follow. These are all important for showing that other people, government, other healthcare providers, that midwives are safe and good care providers. So this is a critical, showing this and showing that we have these skills is an important part of growing an acceptance of midwifery and growing the midwifery profession, but it also can create problems, right? So it creates issues around defining what midwifery is. So when we're trying to prove that midwives have good skills, that we have a way we work, you have to define what midwifery is. And then whenever you define what something is, you're automatically also creating a definition of what it isn't. It creates a hierarchy of knowledge where we are prioritizing some people's knowledge over other people's. Often that is a prioritizing of Western knowledge, of medical knowledge, of formal training, university-based education. We're defining who gets to be a midwife and who doesn't get to be a midwife. And then I think it's important to think about who does this benefit? And then who gets to call themselves a midwife and who doesn't? And while I think the professionalization of midwifery is really important and was important for the growth of midwifery and for a wider acceptance of midwifery, we also have to see that these were problems that were created. And we have to think about how these can be addressed. And to think about really whose knowledge and whose skills as midwives get recognized and whose don't. So I want to just talk a little bit about, so what are some other options? So we have examples. Some of these examples on my slide are current examples. So some of them are education specific. So where different versions of education programs have been recognized, but the midwives who graduate from those programs or do the prior learning assessments still become registered with the provincial regulatory body and need to follow those guidelines and rules. An example of a recognition of a community-based program would be midwifery, Inuit-led midwifery in Nunavik, where their practice and teaching and learning is based in the community with Inuit midwives, and that all the education happens there. But the education program itself is recognized by the regulatory body, and graduates of the program become registered midwives. There's also places where a prior learning assessment can be undertaken, and where midwives would still, depending on how they learned, still become midwives registered with the college or the regulatory body. Then there's examples of regulation specific to practice. So I already gave the example of exemption for Indigenous midwives in Ontario. We could think about, this is an idea, not a current example, but regulation with a provincial body that is specific to Indigenous midwives. So using criteria specific to Indigenous midwives, being regulated by or being led by Indigenous midwives, but still being registered with the regulatory body. These are just some options that are either out there as actual examples or ideas people are talking about. And I really would ask us to think about what else is possible. What are other ways that we can think about keeping midwifery safe for our communities and being accountable to our communities. I think there are lots of different ideas and ways that this can be done. And there's lots of interest right now in growing Indigenous midwifery and thinking how can we do things differently? How do we ensure that we keep Indigenous families safe? And I think there is some recognition that the current model of regulation in Canada hasn't been considering Indigenous families and hasn't always been doing what is best for Indigenous families, and how can we change that? So some questions I think would be good to just think through the rest of the presentations today, and just in like thinking about midwifery and how do we grow Indigenous midwifery, is like, what really is the role of regulation? It's important to like know who is the regulatory body in the province where you are. What is our ultimate goal? And I think our ultimate goal is safe care for Indigenous families. What is it like, what do we, thinking like either yourself, your community, nation, pregnant people, Indigenous midwives, what do we want regulation to look like, and what would safe and good regulation look like in our communities and nations? What are the models that could be used to reach our ultimate goal? And then to think about what are the short and long-term actions that need to be taken to get us there. So that's like my planned presentation bit. I did want to leave some time for questions. I will leave it for Natalie to let me know how much time I'm allowed to go over my allotted time.
Oh, if I'm the timekeeper, we have time for everything. So that was an amazing presentation. Thank you, Claire. So we do have some time for some questions. So I would ask to ask a question, just type your question into the public chat on the right-hand side of your screen. And while I wait for those questions to pop up, we see some comments, such an important topic. Thank you. Yeah, I think, Claire, maybe I'll just start us off if it's okay, as we await for some of the questions. I feel like a lot of what we've been able to observe as well, as Indigenous midwives, with regards to various communities who are interested in reclaiming like that self-regulation around Indigenous midwifery, is also sort of blending some of our natural laws that are maybe part of our culture, and blending some of the Western laws too. And so I wondered if you could, like, you didn't really get into any of the examples, and I don't know if folks are familiar with this. Like, really, this is quite unique to a health professional. We're regulated health professionals, and nursing does not have this, nor do physicians. And I think that somewhat speaks to the history of midwifery, like as a profession. So I wondered if you would just share a little bit of how it's being enacted at this moment, just by providing one example and sharing sort of what that looks like.
Sure. I did get a little bit distracted by reading the chat, trying to read the chat. Can you give me like a short paraphrase of your question again for me, please, Natalie?
Yes. So can you provide an example of successful like self-regulation in its enactment at the moment? Like, I'm obviously thinking about Six Nations because it's the more long-standing. What does that look like? Even just like broad strokes for folks, and this is something that people can look into in the future if they're interested in learning more.
Yeah, I can give examples. I think because I do practice in a regulated model, I think I'm not like the best person to go into details, because I think there's people who are experts in this, who are working under those models. But like Six Nations would be an example that I would that is a great long standing example of a midwifery group and birth center, and that is working under the exemption clause and doing this. And so that would be the one example that I would give.
Great.
I think there was a request for my presentation. I can definitely share my presentation. I will have to take the pictures out of it though, in order to share it. So maybe I can connect with Mary May about that, just because, the pictures are from some people's births, and I want to make sure that I'm respecting their privacy and what they've given me permission to do.
So Jessica McDonald asks, what are your recommendations for encouraging regulatory bodies in provinces without an exemption clause to move towards having an enacted exemption for Indigenous midwives?
Yeah, so I think that reaching out to the regulatory bodies and like looking into if there's already work being done in the province or at the level of the regulatory body around supporting the growth of Indigenous midwifery is a great first step. And I know this work is being done. I meet with members of the CMRC, and I know there's a lot of interest in supporting the growth of Indigenous midwifery and thinking about what that looks like. But I think that's a great, that is a great option in terms of thinking about like, how can the regulation, what can the regulatory body do? What is within the scope of like the regulatory body to change? And what is the scope of what is in the laws, right? Because those are two like very different things. And one or the other is may or may not be easier to do. And I'm sorry, I can't be more specific. It's just when you're talking nationally, it's so different by province. But I think a great thing to do is to reach out to the Association of Midwives in the province and the regulatory body to ask about like, what are they doing to advance Indigenous midwifery, and how can we move those things forward?
Yeah, and I would also echo that in saying that if there are stakeholders, meaning like community members and specific communities who have reached out either to the association and or the regulatory body, it would be an opportunity to learn about how to become an ally to those communities, right? And see if you can be of service to like helping advance their vision of what it is.
Darlene I'll just point out, Darlene has put a comment in the chat that regulatory bodies are accommodating alternative practice models in some places. And so I think that's a great like example of, and I think it's always good to think about like, okay, what are things that can allow us to change the way we practice right now? And they might not be perfect, but they allow some change. What are things that will take that'll take some investment and changing of like bylaws or regulations to make that even better? And then ultimately, like long-term, how do we change the ultimate problem, which in many places is like the law and regulation, or might be changing just like the approach of the regulatory body, or having more community involvement and having more community say. And these are all things that can take time.
Kind of building on that, I see a question from Ximena from Mexico. Hi, Ximena. How do you start the conversation with government to get the exemption for Indigenous midwifery? And we're speaking from the Mexican midwifery context here. So where the Mexican government doesn't recognize us as healthcare providers, but as volunteers.
Sorry, I'm going to go to that. I'm going to try and find that question so I can see it. What does the advocacy for potential Indigenous midwifery students? Was that the question? Sorry, Nat.
I'm going to text it to you.
Thank you. I'm like,
no problem.
I'm not good at reading and listening at the same time.
It's very hard to follow the chat. There's so much action. It's awesome. I love it.
There's some really great things being said in the chat too. So
that should be copied somehow. Okay, I texted it to you. So how to start the conversation with the government to get an exemption clause for Indigenous midwifery. So the Mexican government who doesn't recognize us as health providers, but as volunteers.
Oh, okay. This is such a big question, and I don't know if I can like fully address it well in our time. But I think and it's hard. I'm less aware of I'm less aware of the international context, but I think one place to start actually, which would be really interesting, is Cam and Nakam last year put forward a statement to the ICM that was accepted, the International Confederation of Midwives, about partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous midwives. And some of the things that I talked about today are in that document around what could this look like, but what is important about this and why is it important? And I think that is a place where you can start, because the International Confederation of Midwives is like a recognized body internationally, and now they have this statement about supporting the growth of Indigenous midwifery and partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous midwives, which I know is not always the same, and is often not the same as it is in Canada, but that's a starting spot. I saw Darlene also put in the chat, which is another great idea of like finding your allies and adversaries. So like really finding people in different levels of government who are supporters of Indigenous midwifery, and who understand. And I think this is a hard part. Like medical skill and being clinically excellent are important midwifery skills. And I totally understand that those things are important and needed. And I always say those are things that our communities deserve, just as much as other communities. But the cultural knowledge and cultural safety are also extremely important, and having people, finding someone who can understand that really important part is a good way of finding somebody who can be your ally. That document can be found on the International Confederation of Midwives website. It's a position statement on the partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous midwives. Oh, and Josiane just put it in the chat for us.
Josiane also mentioned, or maybe it wasn't Josiane, it was Isabelle Brabant, was mentioning that Quebec is in the process of enacting the exemption in Quebec. So there is some work being done in that way. So it's all very exciting. Merci, Claire, for your time and for explaining and going into some of these very intricate sort of details. And so we'll move on to our next presenter. And so the next talk is titled Hospital Privileges with Melanie Mason. Melanie Mason is a Red River Métis registered midwife. She lives and has been practicing as a registered midwife on Lekwungen and Wasnek people's unceded territory since the last 5 years. Given Melanie's nation is from Treaty 1 territory, she considers herself an uninvited guest on these territories. She completed her Bachelor of Art at the University of Manitoba, where she majored in psychology and minored in Native Studies. She later went on to complete her Bachelor of Midwifery at the University of British Columbia. Melanie is the co-chair of the Indigenous Midwifery Advisory Council and the Indigenous Advisor at the Midwives Association of British Columbia. Welcome, Melanie. So we'll leave some minutes after your presentation to go through a question and answer period.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Natalie. I have to just say across the board, I'm extremely nervous as I see the participants are quite high, over 300 today. So regardless, I will try my best not to stumble on my words, but if I do, that is why. 2 seconds, I'm just going to share my screen. My presentation. There we go. All right. I was just shown how to present this specific way today, which is amazing. I'm just going to also start a timer because I sometimes cannot stay on track regardless of having a presentation here. All right, so thank you for the introduction, Nat. I think you covered a lot of areas that I was going to have on my next slide, which is basically who I am. So I am a Red River Métis woman. I am a settler, or I am a uninvited guest on Algonquin and WSÁNEĆ People's Territories here in colonial known as Victoria, BC. My pronouns are she, her. I am the mother to Aubrey Jacqueline Carlson. My parents are Jacqueline Mason and Richard McKay Mason. My maternal grandmother is Yvonne Lamontagne, and my maternal grandfather is Harvey Brancagnier. Both are Red River Métis from the St. Clara, Manitoba, and Turtle Mountain Reserve in North Dakota. My paternal side, my grandmother Ruby McKay and grandfather James Mason are both of mixed settler backgrounds. The rest Nat covered. And just throughout my presentation, I've just acknowledged where I've taken the photos. Which territories I am. And I hope you enjoy the pictures of my little one, Aubrey, because I think it's fun to really ground ourselves in why we do this work and who we are doing this work, not only our communities, but also our little ones. So just kind of a background, an acknowledgement of putting this presentation together. Natalie was fantastic in helping me kind of organize my thoughts, as well as Evelyn George. There are just too many elders, knowledge keepers, Indigenous midwives, non-Indigenous midwives, and other true allies to include in where I am and how I got here today as a registered midwife. And of course, my family supports and friends that allow me to do this work as well. The way I've kind of structured the presentation, I have to give acknowledgement to the Honorable Justice Marie Sinclair, who did a presentation on at the Songhees Wellness Center about the TRC, but the way he framed and contextualized where we are or how we identify as an Indigenous person, I found really informative how I talk and present certain things. And I already covered the photo piece. So where we are coming from, so Clara did an amazing job in kind of the introduction of registration. And we know that Indigenous midwifery is one of the oldest professions on Turtle Island, and Turtle Island being North America. As an Indigenous profession, we survived colonization. So how we did that were a multitude of different ways, but the way that we operate, like Claire touched on today, is mainly through streams that are almost entirely Westernized. So that education is through Western institutions. Our role pre-colonization, and this is a very abbreviated list, and I think I'm not going to read everything specifically, but I'm sure in the chat we can put up the Indigenous midwifery knowledge and skills, the framework of competencies that NACM put together, because I think it really highlights how we used to practice pre-colonization and where we need to go going forward in that reclamation work. So where we are now is once we get past that barrier as an Indigenous midwife and getting regulated, the next kind of level is getting a privilege to practice. So kind of overarching in the federal context, we don't have the defined classification of what it is to be an Indigenous midwife within the Treasury Board. So that really restricts us in the way that we practice and who we can provide our services to when we are privileged. Also, without this classification, we also don't have access to federal student loan forgiveness. So not only does it impact our actual practice, but it impacts us as a financial barrier as well. So it's a multitude of different areas that get just that create barriers for practice. On the provincial kind of context, the idea of what are privileges. So I'll flesh out a little bit further down on the next slide, but really it's to provide services as a registered midwife at a hospital or in community. You have to be privileged at a hospital, which means that you need to be able to be recognized by that institution, that you meet all your competencies on a college footing, Depending on which site or which hospital you're registered at, they might have different regulations around continuing competencies, specific certifications or additional training that need to be done. So there's a lot of different rules that you need to abide by as being a privileged midwife within a community. The even more complex piece, besides about how it impacts our work, is about who grants those privileges. So strictly speaking from my experience within BC, where I work and had done my education, privileges are controlled normally within the hospital site by either registered midwives who have privileges already at that site, whether or not there are midwifery higher kind of division heads or directors within a health authority, or if there are no midwives within that community, privileged midwives within that community, then sometimes family practitioners or obstetricians can dictate who does and who does not get privileges. In the BC context, the way that our healthcare services get divvied out is underneath health authorities. So there are geographical locations throughout our province that parcel out care throughout different community sites and hospital sites as well. So it's a little bit complex to go through in this presentation entirely, but I think it's important to know that privileges are complex, and there's a lot of different political impacts and motivations that go into people getting privileges or not getting privileges. So kind of where we are today, again, more broken down. And when we look at that kind of, like Claire alluded to, is the way that people are registered, we can also look at the way people are paid and how that impacts their privileging. So in a self-employed model, like I am in BC and also in Alberta and Ontario, I mean, Ontario has several different ways of being paid. The midwife still bills the Ministry of Health, so it is still a free service for those who have health insurance, like a provincial health number within BC. So that, to be able to practice, like I was saying, as a registered midwife, you have to have privileges at a local hospital. If you do not, you cannot provide on-call services or catch babies. You can apply to be an alternative model and only practice in a clinical-based setting, but again, you can't participate in the scope or the ways in which we currently are outlined within our regulatory body to its fullest extent. So like I'd mentioned, privileges are controlled in a multitude of different ways. And often the way that those are controlled and released are through the lens of the practitioner, not reactive to the community. So really not taking that focus off of what's best for us as a clinician, whether that be a registered midwife or a family practitioner or an obstetrician, but really it should be in the hands of the communities that we're serving and the needs that need to be delivered, right? When you look at salary model, so in all the other provinces, when you apply for your position, as a registered midwife, a privileging set comes along with that position. So you don't have to go through an additional service or an additional process to gain privileges. So it's a little less of a barrier, but again, there's lack of control around who gets to dictate how many privilege sets or salary positions that are released within a geographical area. So say if an Indigenous midwife who is salaried in Manitoba says, I want to build an Indigenous practice, I want to hire on more Indigenous midwives to serve our communities, they would have to go through a multitude of layers in order to get that approved. And sometimes that might not even be approved. So you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, even after you get registered. It's, again, how do you practice and which institution you practice at. With the nation employed model, they don't have privileges at a hospital. So they provide services within their community on nation. And again, is another barrier to access to say if you transferred into a hospital setting, your Indigenous midwife or Aboriginal midwife would not be able to transfer with you. So it is definitely like privileging is complex across Canada. So I hope I'm highlighting the best that I can. And of course, like Claire had mentioned, there are definitely people that practice in these models that would be able to further highlight the differences and the benefits and the downsides to how those privileges are enacted or given out. So really, how did I come to be involved in privileging? So I began my registered practice. So I graduated from the University of British Columbia. I got registered with the College of BC. Well, it's the College of Nurses and Midwives, British Columbia. And then I wanted to practice on the territories that I live on currently. And at that time, there was no privilege set for an Indigenous midwife. In the community, there were no Indigenous identified midwives. And so knowing that, I decided to create my own privilege set. I had support within the community. And by that, I mean the midwives that had trained me and allowed me to practice at their practice, like established practice at Access Midwifery. Lorna McCrae and Heather Wood were very instrumental at making connections for who I could talk to within the health authority and within our hospital specifically, and were really good advocates to say, yeah, this needs to be like a privilege set that needs to exist within our center, like within Victoria General Hospital in Victoria, and like, why doesn't this exist already? So the process was not quick. I ended up starting on as a new registrant privileges, which are usually about a year. And then I got shifted to temporary privileges, which again is not a solidified commitment of being able to work in this community. And then I finally went through the process of getting it solidified into Indigenous specific privilege set at Victoria General Hospital. So 3 years is a long time when you're trying to get a privilege set up and running for here and now. And really, I found that I didn't want other folks to have to go through those barriers. And I just felt really privileged that I had really strong advocates and allies in my practice. And not everybody has those. And also when you're starting up in a new community, sometimes there are no midwives at all that can advocate for you. So, I mean, my focus has currently been within Island Health, but like where we are in the current state that I've highlighted in the colonial system that we're operating in is that even to this day, with the advocacy work I've been doing, there's no process for Indigenous citizenship verification. And we know that people are using our identities to gain or for personal gain or professional gain. And so it's a piece that I want to enact and bring forward within our health authority to make sure that that doesn't happen. There is no protected privileges for Indigenous midwives that are open and waiting, and there's no formal pathway. There's also no retention strategy to say, hey, we've got you privileged, you're working in our community, how do we keep you in our community as a valuable asset? And there is really no other pathway for Indigenous midwives who have trained in different models to get integrated into our healthcare system. And I'll further illuminate something that's happened within BC that says, you know, when an Indigenous midwife doesn't get privileges and can't work in their selected community, there's no follow-up. There's no policy to say accountability pathways for anybody within the health authority through leadership or local community to say, hey, this is not okay. How do we remedy this situation? So, so just to further illuminate that case, there was a First Nation within BC that said they wanted the services of an Indigenous midwife. This Indigenous midwife was currently practicing as a student on their nation, and that student was currently working out of their health authority, out of their health unit on nation, like on reserve. And the nation said, hey, we want to keep you. We want you to work for our nation, which is a big honor, right? The newly graduated Indigenous midwife, so after she completed her education, applied for privileges within that community at the local hospital. The application was not supported by the privileged non-Indigenous midwives within the community. And so what that meant for that Indigenous midwife is that she couldn't practice in that community, and she was forced to relocate to another community within BC. So we know that First Nation lost their Indigenous midwife. So they lost Indigenous services that they were asking for and requesting. And like I said before, there was no accountability to or institutional record that this even happened within this health authority, and how we can look at that record and say, how do we prevent this from happening in the future? So really, kind of where are we going? Where are we taking where we've been through, where we're now, and like, how can we remedy the situation? Where would we like to bring this forward? And again, I'm speaking from the context that I have within BC, and only what I think is best, right? There's going to be a multitude of different approaches that are appropriate for communities. But how I see it is like, we really need to have Indigenous-led healthcare innovation that's grounded in Indigenous midwifery approach. So really driven by the communities themselves that say, hey, like we've brought together a council of elders, knowledge keepers, life givers, doulas, anybody within the community that says, hey, we want these services provided in our community. And this is who we want to have provide those services. How we can root ground our work within what the community needs specifically, right? So if we're looking at reclamation of birth within that community, reclamation of practice and scope, so going back to the traditional ways in which we practiced before colonization, looking at even constructing a birth center on nation, or for those communities that say, hey, we're not ready for that, let's talk about a safe evacuation policy and plans that connect life givers to Indigenous midwives in either urban or rural centers at their choosing. And I have this idea in which you can virtually connect with an Indigenous midwife prior to evacuation. So really connecting client to provider well beyond, and really gaining that relationship and trust, so that a person feels safe leaving their community. Of course, it's like safe is a personal construct, but the idea is letting people know that they can get services in a different community from a safe provider is important, right? So really, when I'm saying, kind of grounded in Indigenous midwifery approach, we do relationship work, right? And it's a lot about trust building and through that continuity and consistency in what we bring to communities. We really need to look at the community itself and say, do we take a team-based approach to care, and how those other healthcare providers in the community can work with us and along us and support us, and how do we support them? And then really looking at our partners within the federal and provincial, provincial governments, and saying, okay, who are our stakeholders? How can we be built up to do this work that we need to do? So really, again, like taking a focus within Island Health, because that's where I'm practicing. I really want to create, or I envision this creation of like an island-wide Indigenous midwifery strategy. And so it really looks and embeds strategies within policy, so that it's not this one-off, what I did, right? People shouldn't have to go through multiple barriers to get working. So really looking at recruitment, we know we come with additional competencies. We know we have great things to offer communities, those who are Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So how do we get Indigenous midwives working here? How do we, again, look at a privileging pathway that is different and set outside of non-Indigenous midwives, so that there isn't that control or lack of support in order to get Indigenous midwives working in community? And then once we have Indigenous midwives in community, how do we retain them? How do we make sure that they feel confident in providing services to their communities and connecting them, to other stakeholders, either within the health authority or within the province? I really want to look, so I talked about the network system and the privileging, but also part of that is look at leadership roles within the privileging process and also within the health authority. So really getting us a seat at the table to say, hey, this is a problem, or this is what we envision as Indigenous midwives to be a good way of moving forward. How can we get that done, and who do we need to talk to? I don't know, I'm just making the bold assumption that everywhere else within Canada or globally that it is hard to enact things immediately, and you have to move through various levels of bureaucracy, and especially in Canada within a colonial context, that it's really hard to know who to talk to and how to talk to them in order to get things moved. So, I mean, even my position at where I am at the association is understanding who is who, and within the federal level, within the provincial level, and within my health authority level. It's not an easy way. But all that to say is we need to create pathways that create connection and support. The other thing that I really wanted to adapt is the verification process. So really, when you stand up and say, this is my nation, these are the people that claim me as an Indigenous person, there is some verification to that. Just like moving from a citizen of Canada, I present my passport when I go to the United States. It's the same way that we also talk with our people across Canada about saying, this is who I am. I'm a Red River Métis woman, and these are my lineage and where I come from. So it's not a new process. It's just a different way to identify that throughout a colonial structure. If anybody's interested in reading, we devised one, the Indigenous Midwives Advisory Council created our Indigenous citizenship verification process. And so we can talk about that. I can answer questions about it. But it took some time, and it took a lot of folks coming together in order to say, this is what we think we need now, right? Sorry, I usually go on various tangents when I'm trying to present. So really the next piece about privileging would be about workforce planning, and that piece that I said of like, who is dictating how midwives are getting hired and other maternity providers, and really why isn't the community who needs services have a seat at that table? So really, why are they not being brought in to that privileging table and say, hey, what does your community need? Who would you like to see working within our community? How do we keep your community safe? So I think those Indigenous communities need to be directing the hiring process of our maternity providers. So how do we get there? So I've talked a little bit about my role as the Indigenous advisor and the co-chair of the Indigenous Midwifery Advisory Council. These positions at our Midwives Association of British Columbia gets me a seat at tables throughout the province to be able to talk with people who can make change. And it really, like I was saying before, it's like knowing the colonial structures and where you fit in and how you can enable change. And it's not easy, but it's how I've been trying to approach this work. It's also seeking funding for this work, right? To look at privileging across the province and say, how do we open doors? Building on what we got for great funding for Indigenous midwives, which is pretty groundbreaking within BC, was that we get funding from the ministry to actually do cultural work, So non-clinical cultural work, and those lines kind of blur as an Indigenous midwife, to be honest. But just it's new, and we want to continue that funding to continue our work in the way we do. And we also want to look at continuing to fund our Indigenous Advisory Council, or IMAC for short, because it was only funded for 1 year. So I really want commitment from the Ministry of BC to say, yeah, we see this leadership, we want it to continue on the advocacy front, and we're going to support Indigenous midwives to building back your capacity that we took away. So underneath IMAC is really looking at the development of Indigenous specific programs. One of those being like a landscape of looking at privileging and how to create that roadmap in all health authorities in all our hospital institutions. And then really, which is Natalie and myself are involved in a new research pilot. It's a national pilot, and it's really looking at midwifery scope and how we can integrate into primary care practices. So working along family practitioners and really examining our scope, or how or what we can do under legislation, and really say, hey, how can we actually pull back those pieces of the way we used to practice pre-colonization, and basically prove that we're good at doing this work, right? And also gaining education in order to know the Western ways of doing this work, so we can provide that to our communities as well. So again, it involves looking and talking to our college at BC, the ministry, and just a multitude of stakeholders. And we're really excited to see. So it's starting in March. I mean, the research pilot has been going on before this, but Natalie and I are hoping to start in March, and then it'll be a full year till next March. Sorry, I'm just very cognizant of my time. But really, I just want to throw it out there. Like, a lot of folks say, how can I support Indigenous midwifery? What can I do? We all have some level of power and influence, right? But it's knowing how to leverage that power and influence. If you are a life giver within your community, you can bring services to your community. A very amazing case was just recently demonstrated in Bella Bella territory with a life giver who made sure that midwifery services were brought to her nation and that she was able to birth on her territory. It's mind-blowing how just that one life giver made things happen. You can look, to your association, to your college, and really, if you are a non-Indigenous person, who should be driving this direction, or who should be driving this, and who should be directing in this reclamation work? Who needs to be consulted? How do we support this work? And really, at the end of the day, who's going to be funding this work? So I'll leave it open for questions. Sorry, Nat, I think I ran a little bit over time.
I was born just before 43 weeks gestation, so I believe there's time for people to run on their own time. This is what happens when you make me the MC. So wonderful presentation. Thank you, Melanie, for highlighting, I think, the important work of our life givers who stand against and are resisting those evacuations and are reaching out for that support. And I think they stand with many behind them who didn't always maybe have that courage, but I think they really are inciting important change that we can see happening. I have one question for you. There's been so many comments in the chat, lots of encouraging, beautiful things, so you'll get a chance to read that. So one thing that Kenora midwives are asking is, can Melanie clarify the slide regarding privileges? Specifically, if registered midwives are working according to an alternative practice agreement, but do not have privileges at a hospital, can they attend births outside of the hospital? I think this was a comment that Carol actually made in the, and I think this is a difference between Ontario regulation and BC regulation, but I'll let you tackle it, Melanie, if that question, if you feel like you can tackle that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's complicated in the fact of Indigenous midwifery is here today because people continue continue to practice Indigenous midwifery, whether or not they were given the privilege to or not, right? So are there Indigenous midwives who are currently attending births without being registered or having privileges? Of course, that's how we survive colonization. But specifically as a registered midwife, if you're working in alternative practice and don't have privileges at a hospital, no, you cannot attend people at birth at home. So because you would not be able to say do a home birth and then transfer into the community hospital.
So it's a requirement that's sort of specific to BC. I see Carol has their hand up. We'll take one more. Go ahead, Carol.
Okay, sorry. I was just going to say that in Ontario, if you're a registered midwife and you have gotten funding to open a practice and your privileges haven't come through, you can begin practicing. It's just the minute you walk into that hospital, or if they're trying to open up a new place and, for example, the physicians are resistant, but the public want midwifery, like, or the hospital's resistant, you can open up that practice and then you transfer care the minute you have to go into the hospital for anything. But there's nothing stopping you from opening up your office and starting providing care to people and delivering them at home or a birth center.
And I think that's where it's different in British Columbia.
Yes, it may be different in British Columbia, but I know I was told specifically because it was very difficult for me to get privileges in my own territory as well. Like, people were just resistant and being mean, to be honest. And it just took a long time. And I got it like within the final hour of my first delivery. You know, she was like 39 plus weeks and hadn't delivered yet. So, but I could have attended her at home.
Well, maybe I'm confused. I see Joanna Norman says it's the same in BC. So I don't know, but it wasn't the way it was explained to me. You can start a practice and attend home births while applying for your privileges.
Yeah, that's not my understanding in the way that the regulation works within BC. If you want to do primary care services, including delivery. So being the most responsible person or MRP for that person that you're attending at home and transferring into hospital.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Melanie. Obviously a nuanced thing, as we can see. And so I really appreciate you taking the time today, sharing your knowledge, giving us a bit of a bird's eye view of what's happening in British Columbia and how you're trying to advance things in that way to sort of increase access to Indigenous midwifery care. I love hearing about all of that. And so I'll thank you for your presentation. And right now it's time for the first door prize. So today's door prizes were generously donated by Sandra at Creators Gifts, which can be found at creatorsgifts.ca. So the first door prize is this beautiful drum bag. So let's go to the randomizer for the draw. And I see it happening right now. It looks like Sage Thomas is the chosen person. Yay! Awesome, Sage. Congratulations. So at the moment, we're headed into our first 15-minute break. So depending on where you live, that's going to be on the hour. If you're like me in BC, that will be at 11 o'clock. If you are in Ontario, I think it's going to be 2 o'clock. And if you're somewhere else, you're going to have to figure it out. But 15 minutes. We'll come back together and continue our learnings and sharings.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you haven't run off on your break right away because we do have a video for this break time. So I'm just going to pull up our this is a video that we have to share for you by Pauktutit, the Inuit Women of Canada. Pauktutit Inuit Women of Canada is the national nonprofit organization representing all Inuit women in Canada. Their mandate is to foster a greater awareness of the needs of Inuit women and to encourage their participation in community, regional, and national concerns. There is going to be a national Inuit Midwifery Forum. And so this is an exciting announcement. The reintegration of Inuit-led midwifery services in Inuit communities is a top priority for Pauktutit. To that end, Pauktutit is hosting a virtual National Inuit Midwifery Forum on March 28th, 29th, and 30th from 12 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time as the first step towards the development of a multi-year rights-based framework to accelerate the integration and implementation of Inuit midwifery services, training, and education across Inuit Nunanga. If you are interested in attending or would like more information, please contact Pauktutit at nimf@pauktutit.ca or visit pauktutit.ca to register. And so we're going to put those links for you in the chat. So there was a midwifery video project last year in commemoration of National Day of the Midwife. Pauktutit launched Inuksuk Our Right, an Inuit midwifery advocacy video that captures the voices of Inuit midwives by highlighting the challenges, gaps, and needs of midwifery services across Inuit Nunanga. The stories depicted in the video serves as a tool for Pauktutit to engage and influence policymakers and stakeholders involved in the program development related to the reproductive rights and health of Inuit women, including the need for midwifery services throughout all Inuit Nunanga. And so we'll go ahead and show this beautiful video. We showed it during the forum last spring. If you saw it, it's a beautiful one. You'll want to see it again. And then we'll see you after the break.
Hattarniarita innartorlu ni ippiligautiaqattaq ritaitsamani uimajaaraungimmata ini pidjusingittiguunganeaqaruarpa qalluna pidjusingittiguunganeaqaruarpa uimajaarnertaqangitsiarluni ippiligautiarluni taan ermisuksiidiuju qaujimangman uuma arnnautiminganik natsileqqaliarisaarningani pigiartugu ileqqusinga isumanga qanu attortauvarliamanga qaujimangman anaanaujurlu qaujimalluni pimmariutitauisariaqarikriillarittaqa utertitauisariaqallarittu ermisuksiinilerani isumanga iluringa aulaninga qaujimammata tukisiamaqattautimmata uuma uqartangani taanna itsuma imeittukkuuraorsimat imeittukkuura atsigingittun inulerijiangma taanna midwife inulerijimi iluani tigumeqasiutjingman
nutaaqtaitsi nutaaqtaakissu aqnanit nutaaqsaarninginnik neritsiaattamangata immini kamatsiamangata ippiussiaasarsuti lerusimiungaan nunalakittuunginaatlui mikiorluunginaatlua tasuugussutik nutaaqsahaltuamaqutaanna aqna nunalalimatsiamu kamariutsiasuuvinia uumarutuamata nutaaqsalitaana nerikkatoqqaavattuvinia nutaaqsaharma neritsiahattaruinermi immini kamatsianermi imitnilsialaqaatsutta kamariutsiasuni.
In the olden days, when the nurses that were in the region, the few nurses that were in the region could not deliver babies. So the midwives had to do difficult deliveries. There's a story in St. Louis, a lady from Hudson Bay Company was pregnant and had to deliver her baby, but her pelvis wouldn't open. The midwives, they didn't cut up that person. They did what they knew, and this was using a piece of wood and pressure it on the pelvis to help that person open up. Nobody in this world would do that except Inuit midwives.
Angi hatigiilornimata quunnassilahisimarta inunnu aulatoislugu aanniavi tukisimarunu sunani kinguumatsimangata taqa nutaaqtaatsiiriunirmi kinguumanalaqtillugu asiriolaqtillugu taakkua sivullertuuluorsuin loorsimalua tukisimanikungannu aluinnanikungannu
uvigartua piulorsimarunga taitsimaniinutaaqtaariartusunga hatsilitaqqiaramaanga taqatsaraharamara angaman ultrasound tawiartusimalorsimarunga halunaaituuqqaratiarapirat anu kangususurugusimagattau taitsimani uhaasugut aqatlu anaanniivangaluunniin angarniivangaluunniik ataatanganniluunniik malamansuarmi panikala inuuleriaqallorsimaru 40 weeks ngiluaraapinginnaasuni taawannutaaqtaarsuarsunga illingamittua piusimaru kingittuaalmiisunga natermuuria arata amisaalilluka piaartaarsortui ilakkaamisigi uimmangariinnutaaqtaatsigiu paluumalut uhaaratigiernasiuraaloorsamangitugut tamanaliagilorsamangimiara.
I felt like I had to spend money on food. I feel that it's taking away your rights to be away from home, from your family. And that should change.
Inui aqne inungi kaloorti nunamini anaqamini nutaaqtaa unnayaahmata hanimau angimat nutaaqtaa titsiuni ullumiulertu maquilingaruuraarsuni piusihartugu inuttitullu hallunaartitullu uhoosituinaku inuutsuta iliseesuugta piniarniku atupiartini iliseitsuta tusaajartini ilisiartausta teemaatsainartau nutaaqtaatsini iliseilitavarta siani ilisigiahasuurumiugu hallunaa piusingani piusiharalaatuinnerarta
arnani ikarorumalerama asikkani piaartaarasuartalangaruapini anaanaugiortunilla piaartaatuqataarmalalianartualutsuni hanuingituarma anaanagiyoru piaraapillu
suna anantsera midwife housemer toqungalerputaqataqa
Okay. Okay, can you try say something right now?
Tamani.
You just heard me?
Since 1998, I was a postnatal worker first for 3 years.
I was growing up here, and I've seen my sister being born when I was a child, and I've read my mother's midwifery books.
Nutaaqtaatsinga mitususimaruga. Pinasuaqsimaqa mikaruktusu. Akinisima midwife-ammo. Puungani pipit nutaaqtaama puungani piqsititusimaru. Tai.
Teiko ilisimaraka an pinsuaqsunga ilsaqtatavinika ilsaigutigu mammiyaka tamakununga nutaagulertunnun ilsaagulertunnun ilitsisimaraka pinsuaqsunga ilitsiqatatavinika.
I went south first, and for my second, I had a home birth at home. Nutakaktaqa meanek kami isuaqtu kingumanaqtu sunilu sapumiyon na suni ammalu natural. It's just what we need, and we need that for all over Inuit communities.
Kisentamani puungtumi nutaaqtaarsaarsun isuarinerpaarasimaraqale uimanga aratlu kamatsiastilu isuartoruaq illingalun isuartusianguaqatsuni tukaraqamatuaqami tukaraquntu tukurariahangitu
Ikaruqtauqallariaqturiyaqa piiqqutilaqauqua kunintausuummata aqunialas itusuummata. Salaqasumlaqat. We need more bigger space. We have only 4 delivery room. Ang inuksami, aanemingito, isumaramiyaka, lisaktuhat sa lokbat. Alianaqtuuma malatuutahatsiasuni ilarin.
Ananaqa angihatiriyaqa ammalu kingumaqiyarniivaqu angaruqhalakattinu kinaraliriinulu apiqsutortaqataalsuuqatta sanaqatauqiaqulutinnasuuqmiqatta kamakkiluqtausta ilitaqiauliumiqahaqqaqurek to be more recognized and to be valued.
People who are in charge of these decisions of like what kind of services people are allowed to have or not allowed to have would be good if they could understand midwifery care better, because I was a registered midwife and I worked solely in Rankin Inlet for 13 years. So we had mostly Southern-based training because we have to be able to communicate properly with Southern practitioners if we're going to be transferring care especially. But we also need to know Inuit knowledge about midwifery and birth.
The training program. Teinero kisani kamajivo tapajuni kallak tukuror simamman. Niriunero simajo. Inungni ilisaidun nahatarnartuning. Inuktitur ini qaujimajing ninginni pidjusinginni ilisaidun nahatarnartun atuin naharumarar simagata. Unfortunately, that was not supported by the Department of Health. We lack funding, full funding for those who were interested in becoming midwives, but they only ended up being maternal care workers, so they could not move on to midwifery.
They weren't given any jobs. There was no jobs for them to be had.
They were promised there would be jobs.
They stopped the funding. Whoever they are, I'm not even sure. There was no more funding for no funding approved to further the midwifery education program. There was 2 of us in Rincon, and due to burnout and lack of support, we had no choice but to resign. We were just too burnt out. If there is no training for Inuit midwives, there will be no birthing centers anywhere. There will be no midwives, no Inuk midwives.
Ilunti anak amilun nakahaktorayakka amalonunali atuni hauri maralinuta taitsiyuni mitsano amaloa nutaaqtaitsi nunali asiani pisimatsipitikliunnasaarmata ilisaiaqtorpilunni. Ilsihatayin kalorsta yainua intitu ilsayuillu hallunaartitu ilsayuillu at igituinnamiatuutigaluarsati taimaatsaina utaaqtaitsigi nikinguumatsiyui anaqami nutaaqtaarmuutsuamiyui ikalorсисуинлуннуналимми икалорсиюраан калуарами кисиани икалорсиоқвааралу илариини иларитсианерми ануи тататсинерсаусни.
Hello, everybody. We're back. Thank you for that video, Pauktutit. And I wanted to let you all know that, and I pasted it in the chat, that Pauktutit is having a reintegration of Inuit-led midwifery services gathering, and that's happening virtually March 28th and 29th and 30th. And the information is there to register to advance that important work. So thank you, Pauktutit. And now, so it's a very inspiring video. And so our next presentation that we have now is going to be on hidden policies with Karen Lawford. So Dr. Lawford is an Indigenous midwife from Lac Seul First Nation in Treaty 3 and a registered midwife in Ontario. Her research focuses on comprehensive, gender-inclusive, sexual and reproductive health care for Indigenous people, with a particular focus on the provision of maternity care for those who live on reserve. Dr. Lawford seeks to identify the barriers to achieving equitable health services for Indigenous people She was the 2020 Inspire Laureate in Health for her research and policy work on mandatory evacuation for birth. And so let's welcome Karen Lawford, and we'll be sure to have some questions, question time after your presentation, Karen.
Thank you. Good morning. It's not morning. It is for you, Nat. Hello. I'm going to do a share screen, and it takes me a second to get things super organized. Look at that. Oh, that's the map of New Zealand. Let me just. So I have a monitor here where I'll have my presentation. I have a monitor over to the right so I can see, and I do have the chat open, but not the Q&A. Oh, why not put the Q&A? Why not? So I can see everything. Hi, Nicole. So nice to see you. I hope you see Nicole Gonzalez is in the chat. If you don't know who she is, please take some time out of your day or week and learn about her. She's an incredible person. We are very privileged to have her here with us. So thank you for inviting me to talk about policies. I was thinking about the word hidden, and I think that perhaps hidden might demonstrate some type of intention more than invisible. So I call it invisible, but I do like the concept of hidden as well. So a little bit about me. I like this little cat. As Natalie shared, I'm Indigenous. I'm Anishinaabe from Nemekasiping, which is a small little place that I'll show you in the next few slides. Everyone knows how much I love water. If I could turn into a mermaid, I would. There's some frozen water I'm standing on. It's probably about 6 feet thick as I'm ice fishing way north near actually Prince George. Is that right? I'm just gonna look. Look at me looking all over the place now. Actually, where Norma Rabbit Skin's around, where their community, it's get cold up there in the winter. That's some nice water, I think, in one of the Dakotas. And on the picture on the right is me with my kukum, and she's teaching me how to fillet red sucker fish. And red sucker fish came into our nets as a gift, and it's prepared very specially. It's quite a fatty fish, one of my favorite fish, actually, and we smoke it, and we have to be careful because of the fat content, not to eat too much, because otherwise we'll get sick, but it is so good. Yeah. Any issues, just checking the, yeah, awesome. Making sure everyone's can see me. So this is where my family's from. And over here, you'll see, I think you can see my cursor. This is where Winnipeg is. And you would take the Highway 17 and then at Vermilion Bay, just head north to Red Lake. And then you would fly for about half hour, 45 minutes. And right at the end of that little dot, that little arrow is where my family's from. And my family has traveled in between Pikangikum and Lac Seul, which is near Sioux Lookout, for eons and eons. So I'm actually the first generation not to be born at home. And in my community, my children were actually born at home, but not in the community. I'm also the first generation to not speak Anishinaabe-Moin as my first language. So this just gives you a sense of our isolation as a family, as a community of people. When I give these presentations, I'm just going to grab a Kleenex. You may notice that my tone changes and I may seem angry or sad. And sometimes it's easier for me to be angry than just overwhelmingly depressed with some of the things that I know. And so this water, this idea of water in this picture is the water's coming down this beautiful rock face, and it's full of energy. And then it has, you can imagine all the bubbles and the loudness and the sound, and then it's starting to trickle down in the bottom right-hand picture. And I'm sure you can imagine a really still water where all of that water is just collecting and coming together again. And I think that while that's a preferred state of being, sometimes the topics I'm going to share with you today actually have me very strong feeling. And I'm just sharing this with you to give you a heads up that you may notice I'm not mad at you. I'm just so frustrated that this is where we're at. And today has given me so much hope, as it always does. Natalie, merci, merci. My Anishinaabe name in English translates to winter fire. And this is, if you know me, you know it's perfect. And it goes with the slide before, because in the winter time, you want to be really close to that fire because you're so cold with all that snow. And I think today where I'm at, we got about, I'd say 6 inches of snow, and it's gorgeous. It's perfect. But if you go too close to that fire, you're going to get a burn, and you have to be careful not to melt your running shoes like I've done, trying to keep warm. So I have to remember for myself that I have to be still warm and I can burn bright, but not to burn out, quite literally. Also to be careful with my words so that I don't hurt anyone. And this is something I'm still learning in my life. And I do have to give a huge kichimikwach to Carol Cucci for helping me along this path. So Indigenous people's health and well-being are directly related, and I'm just going to talk a bit about Canada, but I'm sure those of you in New Zealand as well as United States can relate to this, and wherever else you are. You know, it's related to Canada as a nation state, how Canada was formed, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and in Canada, Christianity was certainly leveraged and used as a way of killing the Indian and the child. And this is something that, you know, I have to think about when I say this, but it would not be the whole truth if I didn't include that. Definitely the loss of land, the theft of land of Indigenous peoples' areas, and the destruction of our governance systems, knowledge systems, our health and wellness practices, as well as our practitioners. I'm going to cough now. So what is policy? I'm going to come back to this slide again because it's something that, and I have worked in Ottawa for Health Canada. I actually held a midwifery file for a brief moment. And if you were to ask all the policy analysts what policy is, they wouldn't really be able to tell you. I would bet you out of 100 people, maybe one person could tell you, but I'm going to tell you, it's so easy. It's whatever governments choose to do or not to do. And if I were to, and because I can, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just highlight something here, because this is actually something that people do not pay attention to. It's also what governments choose not to do. And that's highlighted in yellow so that you really see it, because sometimes it's what people choose not to do that's harder to see. Also, who gets what, when, and how. So government allocations, what they get, when they get, and how they get it. You can think of this as resources, generally, health workforce, money, any type of allocations. So it can be real, like money, or it can be something like even the privilege of speaking, the privilege of practicing, for example. And definitely policy is a government commitment to the public to follow an action or course of action in pursuit of approved objectives. And so we see here a range of really about what is policy and how that is intertwined with governance. And here I'm going to talk about government. And if you have any questions about my specific slides, they are numbered. So don't be shy to say on number, whatever can you clarify X, Y, or Z. So tools used by government to help influence and guide citizen behavior, interactions with each other and whatnot are generally legislation. And I did number these in a type of hierarchical order. So legislation is a higher level guidance document. It is a legal framework. And you did hear Claire speak about this in the morning. Then you have regulation, and you also heard Claire and Melanie talk about this. The regulation gives a legal force, so it enforces the legislation, and the legal directives, of course, being the legislation. And in Canada, let me just think. Yeah, for sure, Canada. I'm sorry, I don't know enough about New Zealand or United States to speak to this more, especially United States is so different in the way they organize their country at a federal level. But This would be the regulations then for everybody in Canada would be the Constitution Act of 1982. So policy then fits into this tool, this government tool, because it's how governments direct implementation of legislation. So, and generally policies align with legislation. So if you think of it as governments implementing legislation, then we're going to go back to the policy. It's whatever governments choose to do or not to do. And that seems pretty, I'm going to fix this because it's bothering me. Oh, it's really bothering me. I'm going to fix this over here so I can see. There we go. So just think of this, that governments are making decisions on your behalf, and what they choose to do or not to do impacts you as a person, as a group, as a family, and whatnot. So before going on, I have a few definitions to go through with you, and certainly Evelyn George shared a few definitions. I'm going to cough. Excuse me, I cough when I'm nervous. So colonialism is a process through which one group takes control of another group's lands, resources, and governance authority, and maintains that group in a state of subordination based on beliefs of racial and cultural inferiority of the subordinated group. And how does white supremacy fit within this? And this is a quote. By white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutional and social settings. Now, if I could highlight a word in here, is this concept of reenactment. Let me just highlight that as well. And this is will lead us into another definition I have when we're going to look at institutional and systemic racism. So what's racism then? The systemic subjugation of members of targeted racial groups who hold less socio-political power and are racialized as non-white as means to uphold white supremacy. Racism differs from prejudice, hatred, or discrimination because it requires one racial group to have systemic power and superiority over other groups in society. Often racism is supported and maintained both implicitly and explicitly by institutional structures and policies. Oh, if I could just highlight policies there for you. Cultural norms and values and individual behaviors. Looking at the comment from Alex, actually everything that I'm saying, I don't know if that comment is to me, everything I'm saying is actually based in the evidence. I'm a professor and I have 4 degrees, and I'm quite recognized nationally and internationally for my work. I don't know if that addresses your concerns, Alex, but certainly I'm well respected. I'm also a member of the, oh yeah, cool, thanks. Just to make sure I'm not, again, texting is so weird, so not at all, I don't mind. But again, this is a good question. What kinds of legitimacy does Karen have in saying this word? And I don't mind at all anyone asking me because I get to be asked. Thank you, Alex. Not at all, no worries at all. And so institutional or systemic racism is the practices that perpetuate racial disparities, uphold white supremacy, and serve to the detriment and harm of persons of color and keep them in negative cycles. Institutional systemic racism also refers to policies. Oh, I'm just going to highlight that there for you. So you're seeing how strong policies are that generate different outcomes for persons of different race. These laws, policies, and practices are not necessarily explicit in mentioning any racial group, but work to create advantages for white persons and disadvantages for people of color. The next slide is actually a copy of a tweet from October. Oh, I can't believe that was a year and a half ago almost. So this is something that's really been in, especially with February being Black History Month. You know, racism in medicine is so pervasive perverse, and pervasive, that scientists will exploit Black people's bodies for therapies to benefit white people, yet at the same time claim Black people's bodies are so peculiar that diagnosis and therapies must be corrected for race. So here we're seeing the way that the things that I've mentioned before in the previous slides, the definitions, colonialism, white supremacy, racism, and institutional or systemic racism combine to actually then not just harm Indigenous people, but here's an example of someone who's drawing attention to anti-Black racism in healthcare. And certainly, I think we all know about this, especially because it is Black History Month, and we can actually go on the Twitter if we had the interest to read that. Oh, good. I'm so glad Damie knows Dorothy Roberts. Yay. And based on, and this is these are my words on this slide. So there's no reference unless you want to reference me. I do think that interfering with Indigenous birthing knowledge and Indigenous birth workers is a direct act of white supremacy, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. And when I go take you down the slides, you're going to see the relationship of policy and forced and coercive sterilization, which of course is a form of ethnic cleansing. So a quick run through, Canada is not that old. 1867 is when most of Canada was formed. Newfoundland joined, I think, in 1947. And then here's a new map. We used to have only 2 territories, and now we have 3. For those of you unfamiliar with the map of Canada, which is probably, well, maybe it's all of us actually. These 3 territories at the top used to just be 2 territories, the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. So Nunavut is a comprehensive land agreement that was formed on April 1st in 1999. So we're looking at how Canada was formed. And a lot of the not so history of, but present day articulations of subjugation oppression by the Canadian government of Indigenous peoples. So in 1876, a few short years after Confederation, the government of Canada brought together all the little pieces of legislation that existed prior to Confederation and joined them all together and put them in one big act called the Indian Act. And this is actually, I have referenced this incorrectly. I apologize. There we go. And this Indian Act is pretty much exactly the same today in a written way as it was in 1876. So things don't really change, do they? Let's pray for this change together. I wish we could take a moment and pray. And here I have 2 slides there, well, 3 slides that are very sad. So brace yourself. I'll have some tea, water. So remember that the Indian Act was 1867. And then in 1879, just a few years later, the Nicholas Flood Davin report noted that the residential school is the principal feature of the policy known as that of aggressive civilization. Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. And this right here, what we're reading, is actually a policy direction, because it wasn't until 1922 that the Indian Act was amended that made Indian residential school attendance by First Nations mandatory. So here we're seeing a very, very strong policy statement by an evil, evil man. Here's another document from Duncan Campbell Scott, 1920. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not an Indian that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Now, interestingly, just 2 years after this, attendance at Indian residential school was made mandatory. And I share this picture because there's 2 creepy things happening in here. I'm going to circle it, and it's this creepy person right here, that man with the hat. And then the creepy person that you don't see is the person taking the pictures, because this looks like a summer camp, and my family would have had something like this. Our summer camp, because we had access to things like wood and not wood, but like finished timbers and plywood and whatnot. We actually had like a little cabin type thing. But this would have been a very joyful time. Children running around, fishing, hunting, always eating, making dried meat. Oh, I just get so excited when I think about it. And that these people are not joyous tells me there's something very bad happening in this picture. And the reason I did share the picture above, which is from the northwest southern side of the United States, is to show the joy, the beauty, when we look at things from a different perspective. And this is a perspective here that is really, it's hard to see. I think we need to see these people though, because they're not with us any longer, but they deserve to be seen. So on this slide are a whole bunch of yucky things. And I'm just going to give you a little heads up with the time. Talk for 19 minutes. I'm going to try to go for 6 more minutes only. And I only have 30 slides and we're at 21. So some of the things that we've done on as Canadians, as Canada, you know, are because of legislation, but also because of policy. So stealing our children, like kidnapping children, destroying Indigenous governance systems. That would have been the first one, policy, then legislation. The second one, policy, imposed patriarchy, imposed patrilineal family relations, forced relocations, confinement. And I don't mean just confinement for birth, but confinement, like moving people and trapping them there, like TB schools, and having to be in a full body cast for 10 years. Someone has their mic on and it's making sounds. Impose a reserve system. So again, confining us physically, knowledge destruction, labeling us as primitive, ironically or unironically stealing all our knowledge and then benefiting it financially through pharmaceuticals, for example. Obstetrical violence that never seems to end. I don't know what's wrong with, there's something wrong here. Refusing care to Indigenous peoples. Of course, we know about Brian Sinclair and Joyce Echaquan. If people need to have those links in the chat, could they be added for people who don't know? Because I think NACM has done some good work with, and Natalie was part of that with the Joyce Echaquan principles. Cool. White supremacy, oppression, misogyny, violently imposing Christianity, making Indigenous people, healers, midwives, and knowledge keepers illegal, our health and wellness practices illegal, conducting medical experiments on Indigenous peoples. My own stepfather was part of the nutrition experiments, electric chair experiments. That was definitely at the hands of Catholic nuns and priests and researchers. One of my friends went into that at the age of 6. Stealing land, breaking treaties, refusing to work with Indigenous midwives. This is not just obstetricians who do this. It's also registered midwives. And I think we need to come to that understanding and truth. And of course, the constant, intense monitoring, examination, and studying of Indigenous people seems to be a way to build people's careers. And that is nothing legislated and there's no regulations, but certainly it is a policy of the Academy. This is where I'm probably going to show that I'm angry. So again, let's go back to what is policy. Whatever governments choose to do or not to do. And I'm not talking, this includes, sorry, not just federal governments, provincial governments, municipal governments, governance systems in hospitals, the board of that, the governance system within the L&D unit, who gets what, when, and how. Definitely, I mean, these are such simple words, but it really does underlie how powerful policy is. And yet some of them remain hidden or invisible, obviously for some nefarious purpose, sometimes just by accident, to be honest, like, oh, we haven't articulated that. But sometimes it is to do really evil things. Again, remembering the tools used by government, legislation, regulation, and policy. Again, we see sometimes thinking of hospitals, how they use legislation either at the federal or provincial levels in Canada, and how they work with regulation and regulators to enact certain policy decisions, again, include or exclude certain people. I have 3 dogs and one of them is going to growl. I'll just turn, Caspar. It's okay. Yeah, my little dog tried to kiss my big dog. It was devastating for the big dog. Forced and coercive sterilization. So this is a good example of how it was a policy across Canada. It was a eugenics movement, obviously a white settler, white supremacist ideology. And then it moved into the legislative world. So it became legislation in Alberta and BC, and then it was rescinded. So now it is a policy again. If you want to follow, if someone can put the name of Yvonne Boyer in the chat, she has some beautiful words to share about how the forced and coercive sterilization of people should be actually made criminal, and is going through the third reading in the Senate, which will then go to the House of Commons for passing, so that it becomes a criminal offense. Because she said, I think she said a number that was astounding, like, was it like 12,000 people have come forward to her saying they've been forcibly or coercively sterilized in Canada. And so these ideas that Canada is just so wonderful is in fact absolutely not true. So here we see a policy becoming legislation and then going back to a policy. So there we go. Thank you so much, Claire and Yvonne. Natalie. So evacuation for birth, traveling for birth is what I research a lot about. It is a federal health policy. It's literally just one line in the clinical practice guidelines for nurses. It has been happening, interfering with Indigenous birthing practices, according to the literature, has been happening since 1896, or is it 1892? So well over 100 years, so getting up to 140 years, 30 years. And the part of this, though, is that midwives cannot work for the federal government. So on reserve is federal jurisdiction, despite being within provinces. And midwives can't work there because they can't work for the federal government because of an issue with not being included in Treasury Board, in the Treasury Board workforce. So I'm going to just jump ahead so I don't take up more time. So what I did in 2016 was published an article that said, how do you find an invisible policy or something? Like, everyone's responding to something, but how can we say, well, that's a policy? Because what you'll often hear is, well, we don't have a policy about that, but yet everybody acts in a certain way. So I say that if you allocate resources to something, you have material impacts, and there's reactions to something, then you have a policy. And this, I think, has been, it's actually the only tool available within the literature right now, because again, actually trying to identify a policy can be harder, especially if the government just decides not to do something. So part of my doctoral research was to, and I have a different slide next that'll be clearer, because this was published in a black and white publication. So what I wanted to do is actually show what the evacuation policy looks like in Manitoba. And this one right here is in color. And what I'll do, I'm going to make it bigger, and I'll start at the beginning. So let me just make this really big. So the green is community, the yellow is provincial healthcare, the blue is in the city, like a municipal, and then the red is where there's nothing. So you see that generally people living on reserve in Manitoba do not have midwifery care, and once they're evacuated, so leave their community, they have no healthcare or prenatal education, sorry. And sometimes they won't even have any prenatal care. But you see the way the different systems, different jurisdictions that somebody has to navigate to receive healthcare. And remember, this is because people are traveling out of their community to give birth. Unfortunately, I was not able to find out, and I did ask around. I'm just going to see, there's nothing in the chat. Okay, cool. What happens when somebody gives birth and they're not discharged, but the baby's well? My understanding is, yes, oh yeah, sure. I'll share my slides too. Okay, so if the person who's pregnant and the baby are well, they're both discharged. If the baby's not just discharged, like is in the NICU, but the person who is pregnant postpartum is discharged, then there'll be some visitation. I don't know what happens with people who have given birth but are admitted. Maybe they're in the ICU. probably the ICU, I was thinking, what happens to that baby? Sometimes they go into foster care if there's no beds in the postpartum unit or the baby unit. Sorry, don't know the words. So again, there's a lot of this paper was very hard to prepare. A lot of people shared with me very generously their stories, and I simply don't have time to go through it all. That would be another, I'm happy to talk to anybody at all about this. The more people who know, the better I think will be, because this has to stop being a secret, because people are going through this alone, and I don't like that. And neither do they. That's the issue. It doesn't matter what Karen Lawford thinks. People are telling me they don't want to be alone and they want to stay in community for birth. That's the issue. Yes, nice. Thank you, Darlene. Darlene Birch is like the most amazing person. Fangirling on Darlene. She lives in Manitoba and is a Cree midwife. Correct me, Darlene, if I was mistaken. So my question is, why do you do the things you do? And I'm asking this as midwives, as people in the community. So you do things as a clinician because of medical directives, like you have to do them. Everybody who walks in the door gets an IV, has an ultrasound, has the EFM put on right away. I don't know. Community guidelines. In our community, we're doing this. Then we also have scopes of practice. And I will put in here, scopes of practice are, what do you think? Claire, if you could jump in here, regulation and legislation? Is that right? I would say. I'm just looking in the chat.
I think that's, yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. But I also wonder, why are you doing the things that you do? Because as Indigenous people, we are rights holders, and we actually don't need anyone's permission to do what we want. It does take courage and strength, like to do things. And sometimes if we act that way, in law is legislation though. So I'll put that in there. Thank you, Vicky. Good point. But I do think at some point we're going to have to stop saying yes and believing what they say and just say, you know what, you do it, you do you, I'll do me. I'll put law in here. Thank you. But I do wonder this, because I think that we're allowed. In fact, I don't think this, I know this. We have inherent rights and responsibilities, and these are actually recognized by the Canadian government, especially through the UN DRIP Act, which was just passed. I know someone can put that in the chat, the UN DRIP Act. Maybe David, you could do that. Yeah. A totally fair comment from Nicole about criminalization that can happen because of this. So I'm going to stop here. Let me just see how much time I took. Oh, I took too much time. I just want to leave you with a gift. This is just outside of, I have the map here. Napier in New Zealand. And I wish I could live here. And I would wish all of you, ask all of you to help me, my dreams to come true. Because I want to turn into a mermaid. That's all I have to share. But I do ask you all, please, why are you doing the things that you do? And I think our next presentation will really help us, give us courage that we might need, at least an example. And I'm so thankful to be here. How do I stop sharing? There we go. Hi.
Merci, Karen Lawford. Incredible presentation, highlighting some of those barriers, some of those underlying root causes that they're so important. I'm reminded of that concentric circle process that Margot Greenwood proposes about the change that we need to make first, at the individual level, whether it's our clinicians and us to better understand colonialism and racism, and then to look at the systems and how we can affect the change within the systems, and then to change those policies and how simultaneously all of those layers need to be undergoing like those levels of change in order for that change to be lasting and meaningful. And I'd like to offer up the opportunity for folks to put their questions in the chat. If they have a question for Karen, I'd love to take one question before we move on to our next. Lots of gratitudes there, Karen.
I do have to say though that, like, when I learn things and I share things, it's never just me. So many people have supported me. They're so kind and generous with their sharing and uplifted me. And I just want to serve you all because I'm getting all tearful. I have so much gratitude for every single one of you who just try and put energy into the universe to help us.
Absolutely. And it's all that allyship that's required on so many levels, like from the grassroots right up to the top, in terms of advancing all of these really important pieces. I'm not monitoring the chat at this very moment.
I'm not really seeing any questions, actually. I'm happy to, people can message me anytime. I'll share my slides. They can reach out to me, but I really think that we need to hear the next people. They're going to show us.
Thank you so much, Karen, for this extremely insightful presentation, for shouldering also, being the messenger of some of these very difficult things as well. And feel like you've been good at being able to share with us how to do that in a good way. So I just really appreciate that. So as Evelyn mentioned, we're running, we're going to attempt to run on time. We're going to provide a shortened presentation of our last thing, just to tell you a little bit about what the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives is doing to advance Indigenous midwifery and birth in the face of colonial barriers. So maybe I can share very rapidly. I'll invite Evelyn George and Carol Cucci to join me into this session. And we're just going to do a very abbreviated version of this, because what we'll do is we'll actually do a longer version and record it and have it available for you. So very quickly, my role at NACM at present is the National Advocacy and Policy Advisor. I've been working a lot on anti-Indigenous racism in the last 2.5 years, alongside our federal partners at the Department of Indigenous Services Canada, but also like with IPAC, the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada, CINA, the Canadian Indigenous Nurses, Health Excellence Canada, and the Friendship Centers, looking at ways that we can impact change with regards to advancing the needle on anti-racism. And so very soon, NACM will have a webpage that will be live, that will have be kind of a bunch of resources that we've been creating, one of which is for life givers, about addressing racism, be it in a prenatal visit or at the time of labor, examples of words that you can use. Also caring for the caregiver. We know that Indigenous midwives experience a lot of trauma as well, working within the healthcare system, so ways to address that. We're looking at measurement tools and data to ensure that some of the resources that we're creating and the engagement that we're doing is having an impact. So you'll be seeing sort of all of those resources coming live, I would say probably at the end of this fiscal, so come early April. So that will be coming forward. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that, because I think we have a lot of strength and we have a lot of things that we can create to contribute to the solutions. And I think that those are all they're all like part and parcel for us moving forward in a healthy way and having a sustainable and long career as Indigenous midwives. So I'll pass it maybe over to Carol, who will talk to us a little bit about the IME, which is our Indigenous midwifery education work that we're doing to allow people to learn more about midwifery and make midwifery education more accessible.
Thanks, Nat. And how long do you want me to talk, F? 10 minutes or 5?
Probably 5.
5, okay. I just want to put a timer on, okay? Okay, so I'm going to really talk fast, quickly. Nando Gishikwe and Dishnikas, Nibising and Dunjaba, Kitaganing and Dayan. Right now, I'm near Maricopa County and the Salt River First Nation of the Pima people in Arizona, visiting my sister for the winter. Appropriately, the traveling midwife is talking to you from her car. So I was very frustrated as a midwife that with my colleagues as well, not just me, about how the lack of Indigenous education for midwifery existed across the country, and how slow our movement of bringing Indigenous midwives to every Indigenous community, and an Indigenous midwife at every birthing family's birth, and knew that it would take generations at the pace we were going, and how to pick that up. And I knew that there were other communities like Nunavik, like Six Nations, that had brought their own education program to their community. We're working hard to be being sustainable. And particularly in Nunavik, it has been sustainable for many years. So I thought, during COVID, I thought, how do we bring that kind of ingenuity and just practicality to everything, to work with what we have, to get the motivation to bring people, to get them started at least. And that I knew if we got people started, and that we worked hard at lighting little fires, that they would slowly grow and be fed, and hopefully they would grow into a full grown bonfire where there would be like birth happening in that place. And it was why I said yes to Norma, because I trusted her. I trusted that her daughter would do everything she could to bring a healthy baby into the world. And I knew that the kind of inspiration that even one birth can make can be incredible. So I really, really worked hard, and I was in a place in my life where I could go and do that. So that's why we went and did that birth, but that's why we started the students. We started a program, or it's not really a program, but a framework of midwifery education that was community-based, based with the community health reps or any kind of prenatal worker that the community was already employing. And we are now teaching them from a distance. We have 6 communities, about maybe 16, 17 students, and we're supporting other communities to do some of this work as well. But for these 6 communities, we're actually having classes and doing intro to midwifery education, and all kinds of history of midwifery, and land-based learning, different beginning starts of midwifery education. And from there, we're going to move on to clinical education. So I know I'm just really skimming over the surface. There was a lot of things that led up to that, but we have gotten funding for the next year, and we're trying to secure funding to go on forever, to bring this kind of education from a distance, and figure out a way to deliver it in an old-fashioned apprenticeship model, but using modern technology to be together as a group and have educators be on Zoom and teach in a virtual classroom. So I hope that doesn't leave more questions than answers, but it's working. I feel this is a program or a framework that will be some of our best work ever, because it will bring more midwives to more communities and more midwives to birthing families. So now I'm going to stop 5 minutes. Wasn't a very good elevator talk.
It's fine. I think it's really just important for people to know what we're working on and what we're doing. And this is really where the innovation is happening, right? And so thanks, Carol. I'm hoping that this screen share works this time. I have a very brief overview about the kinds of resources that NACM has available. So we'll just go right through that. So this is the Restoring Midwifery and Birth workbook. And so this is really a getting started resource. You received this in your swag bag today. This is a fillable PDF. You can order a printed version. You can print it yourself. Lots of ways to use that. Fun to do as a group. This is the Indigenous midwifery, like the framework of competencies that NACM did. Really useful for looking at what kinds of skill sets do Indigenous midwives have, and what does this look like if we wanted to create this here? Or, you know, there are lots of possibilities with this one. This one was also in your swag bag. We have lots of resources that are for handing out, for distributing. These are all on our resources page on our website. What is in progress right now that is really exciting is a midwifery services startup hub. So if you're opening a practice, or if you're looking into what does it take to start a practice, this is really getting into that nitty-gritty details of, you know, how to sanitize the birth space, right? Looking at charting, what kind of examples exist of charting, and equipment list, supplies list, things like this. They're very kind of logistical things in opening a practice, starting a midwifery practice in your community. And then we're also working on this advocacy hub, which is also going to be found online, which is where you'll be able to find examples of, we're creating an annotated bibliography that reviews all of the research and evidence and statements that are available that support Indigenous midwifery, remote midwifery, remote birth, all of the things that will really help create an advocacy strategy. And then also some templates on letter writing, letters of support, how to write a proposal and how to write a budget. You know, we'll have just some things like this to really kind of get your advocacy strategy happening, and have lots of support there for you to do that in your own way. Again, we'll have a recording of the symposium available. I want to remind you of the National Inuit Midwifery Virtual Forum, which is going to be coming up in about a month from now. This is really, really exciting. So you can find the registration web information on their website. And then this is how you follow us. So if you are looking for more information, you want to do this. We're also going to be having a mail out in a few days. So you're going to automatically receive an evaluation survey, which helps us to do these events, tailor them more to what people are interested in, what people need, and liked and maybe didn't want so much of, and things like that. It just really helps us to do a better job. That's coming, but we're also going to have kind of a news flash where we follow up on any of the lingering pieces from today, and we'll let you know how to join in on kind of a debrief session, and also how to find out more of the information that Carol and Natalie and I were going to be sharing today. So yeah, that's that. So I think we can go now to the door prizes, which is so exciting. So I think we're going to get that up on screen. So this is another door prize from creatorsgifts.ca. Sandra at Creators Gifts was the generous donor for our prizes today. Thank you so much to Sandra. I hope you're here watching. So we're going to go ahead with the randomizer for this prize. Kimberly Beatty. Are you here to collect your prize? Yay. And the next prize is this beautiful ribbon skirt kit. These beautiful kits that are donated. So we'll go ahead with the randomizer for the next prize. Natalie Johnson. Congratulations to Natalie Johnson. Yay. And so if Natalie is here, go ahead and send a message that you're here. And then this last prize, this is a bundle bag, again, handmade by the artists at Creators Gifts. So we'll go ahead and put this one through. Jessica Barudin. And so we'll check and see if Jessica's here. I think Natalie Johnson might not be here. We might be doing a redraw. Or we can.
I will double check in the list right now. If you give me just a little second, I'm going to stop my share, check if everybody is here, and otherwise I'll redraw in a second. I will contact everyone to get their correct address from the email list that we have. I'll be just a second.
I think it's okay. I think we'll leave it and they're going to get mailed out anyways. I think that's okay. So congratulations to all the winners. And so thank you again. I'm going to pass it off to Elder Roberta here in 1 second. Just want to say my thank yous first. Thank you again to Sandra from Creators Gifts for so generously donating these beautiful, beautiful door prizes. Thank you to all of the participants who joined today, to Elder Roberta, to all our speakers, to Carol, and for providing the debrief on this, later on. All the CAM and NACM staff who've really pulled together to make this day happen, and Natalie, our MC. You've all made it an awesome, awesome event. And so right now I will pass it along to Elder Dr. Roberta Price to close the event for us.
Hello, am I unmuted, Evelyn?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. What a beautiful, beautiful day it was to listen to all the wonderful, amazing presentations, bringing healing to all of us who witnessed here today, right across Turtle Island. It was so beautiful. And thank you so much for making this all happen. It's just been such a wonderful healing time. Thank you so much, everyone. So I'll share a blessing and a prayer to close us off and go on for the rest of the day. Thank you so much, everyone. Aichka, Aichka, OCM, OCM. We give you many, many thanks, Creator, for bringing us all together today, right across Turtle Island in this virtual way, in such a warm, respectful, and loving way. We kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to continue to wrap each and every one of us and all of our loved ones in your warmest blanket of protection as we all continue on this part of the journey of our lives into 2023. Help us each to keep safe in our travels, both near and far, Creator. And we always give you many, many thanks, Creator, as we ask you to bring all of your blessings down upon all the ones that are hurting, all the ones that are grieving, all the ones that are hungry, all the ones without home, especially, Creator, all the ones that are hurting, all the ones that are grieving. Aichka, Aichka, OCM, OCM. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. OCM, OCM.